let's start with configuring OPC router. The main topic today is connecting Apache Kafka, so we can double click on the Apache Kafka under this plugins topic. And there we can add a new plugin instance just with clicking on the corresponding symbol. Here we give it a name. I just called it Kafka Demo. Here you can give it another name, of course. The broker access is, in my case, the IP address or local host because I installed it locally. And the port is 9092 per default. And if you work with a Kafka Cloud, then with Confluent, then you would have the confluent.cloud broker address. You can use SSL if you want to secure it, and you see the client ID is something that you also see in MQTT or also find in MQTT. You can automatically create a new one here. This is must be really individual, so you do not you are not allowed to have two OPC routers using the same client ID or two producer or consumer using the same client ID. But I can use it with OPC router as a client ID, and I would give it a group. The group is important for the consumer, so you can group consumers having the same group ID to get the same data. So I just would say it's pre-sales demo in my example here. Then we need username and password if we have configured some in the Kafka, but in the local demo example, you do not need anything. We also could use certificates to make the communication trustworthy. Then we can decide whether the certificates will be trusted in OPC router or in Windows. Connection timeout is configured to 10,000 milliseconds. I think this is a very long time here for the local connection. If you have many data, you can use gzip to zip your data to make the data packages much smaller, sorry for my English. And we can say, so if we consume data with OPC router, so OPC router can on the one side be a producer and on the other side he can be a consumer. So if the OPC router is the consumer, we can handle all the data transfer before we acknowledge to the Kafka system that we got the message. So this is a possible reason that we can activate it here. If you say it doesn't matter whether we worked through the whole data transfer, but we will acknowledge that we received the message, then we can leave it out here. And the consume interval will be every 5 seconds here, and we can test connection to make sure that we can connect to our Kafka system. Okay. So I click on OK to add this instance here. So what is our training example? To those who already participated at our webinars know we have a special example behind. So in our example, we have two machines. One machine produces some pieces of a product, and the second machine is the palletizer behind the producing machine and getting the products or pieces of the products and palletize it. We also need the information how many pieces can be placed on the pallet so that the palletizer can put out the pallet when it is ready and take a new one to put the next pieces to the net until we have fulfilled the production goal. So let's start with the producer, which is our case machine 1. Producing and sending this information that it has produced pieces to the Kafka system. So the producing is the new what is produced for this order. Of course, we need our machine. So we go to the shop floor part, our plugins, click on OPC UA, on the click place. to my OPC server, because this is not part of the training today. You see, we have all the possibilities when we can configure the endpoint, we can use a user or anonymous login, we can configure the security mode, whether we use encryptions or only signature or none. And we can also check connection to make sure that we can connect to the system. Okay, so we now have two systems that we can communicate to, and we can start with configuring our first example, therefore. So we have our local service here for the OPC router, and we can structure our connections within folders. So I would create a new folder for the webinar on Kafka today. And there we can create a first connection producing the data. So we say that machine 1 is the one giving the data. So in our example, we use OPC, of course. So we, on the triggers part, the triggers mean that when we want to transfer the data, so we have specific triggers for all destination systems. Of course, also some simple triggers. So if we want to transfer data cyclically, we would use a time trigger where we can send data every second, every hour, every minute, or whatever. We have a cron trigger. This is an extended time trigger where we can send data every first month at the first hour of the day, every 500 milliseconds, for example. So we can make more complex definitions on the time stamps when we want to transfer data. But in our case, we have our machine 1 producing data, so the current amount of the produced parts of this current production order changes. So we would use the data change trigger in our simple example as triggering when we want to send the data or the events of the new that we have produced a new part to the Kafka system. So we now can double click on this after we have moved it to our design environment here. We first select the corresponding OPC server that we want to read the data from. So I have the OPC UA server here that we have configured. You also could configure OPC, classic OPC DA servers, but we want to use the OPC UA technology here. Then we want to have a look at the current amount of the produced parts. So we can use the 3 dots button here on the right, and we can browse through all the available tags. So we have our machine 1, we have the PLC in the machine 1, and we have our production data there. And we have our current data with the current amount. So you can just double click to insert it or use the apply button, whatever you want. So we now know when to trigger or on which data point to trigger. And we can also use the at most and the at last every second. So we can say, even if no data change, we want to trigger every minute or every hour so that we get a corresponding value. Or even if the data changes much faster, we only want to send the data every second to the Kafka system. We can trigger at each data change with the current amount. It is okay. If you would have a floating point number, I would propose to use trigger at an absolute difference. You also could use a percentual difference if you prefer to do it. But in our case, it would be okay to use trigger at each data change. And we use a little extra configuration. We use the metadata output directly, because then we have the possibility, if I click on OK, you can see it, that we have the value, the quality, the time, and the item name of the tag. So we have a look on the current amount of machine 1, and we can get the corresponding information directly from this trigger object. I would just make it a bit bigger because according to the visualization here, I have not that much space. So what is very interesting for us is, of course, the value that we want to send to the Kafka system. Kafka is, like with MQTT, not telling you what format you need for your data. So you can define the data on your own. So you can, for example, use this JSON structure, as we often use with REST or with our MQTT examples. So we can go to the top and have a look at the corresponding transfer object. So the transfer object means the data sources and targets of our data transfer. So we have a JSON write example here, so we can create a JSON structure out of some single parameters, like the value of the current amount, and we also need the information for the production order. So we use the JSON write here, just double click, and then we can configure the structure. So either you insert the field names here, or if you click on edit, you also can configure it with the JSON syntax on your own and just click on edit again, and you get the structure here. So our fields are the current amount. Per default, it is of type value. You can also structure with arrays and objects if you want to. And we have the current production, the production order, product ID. I just insert it here because that you can see that we can also insert more than one field. So we insert it here to the data fields. With this button, you can also duplicate to insert more, you can delete, and you can configure some more options. So we can have the JSON expression here, and you do not have to keep in mind how JSON expressions are programmed. You can also rename the field name so that you only have the current amount as a field name without the corresponding expression signs. And we can click on OK to close it, and you see we have a JSON document and we have the current amount and the product ID. So the current amount we can directly take from the trigger. So if the trigger triggers, we have the current value and send it to the current amount of the JSON document. And in addition, we need the product ID. This is an extra OPC object, so we would scroll up to the OPC transfer objects, and there we have the simple OPC data access objects. And we can double click to edit. Again, select the OPC server, Kep training. With the tag browser, we can browse to the product ID field or data point, and I just double click on it. And we also get this value, and we only have to connect it via an arrow with the product ID of the JSON document. I just would zoom a bit out to get more object on the screen. I hope you can still read it very good. And we want to send the JSON document to the Kafka. So according to, in this case, the Kafka is a target system. We would have a look at the data destinations, and there we can find the Apache Kafka transfer object. We insert it here, we double click to edit, and what we have to do is to select the corresponding Kafka broker. So we use the Kafka demo that we have prepared before, and we can either select an existing topic. This is different to normal MQTT objects that we use with OPC Router, because there you only can insert, but with Kafka you can read out the corresponding existing topics. And our example is sending data to the palletizer, who is the consumer for this data of a palletizing process. So we would select the topic palletizer. You would also could insert some topic here manually. And the other possibility is to create a dynamic topic. So you could create it during runtime, just send an arrow to the corresponding topic field then. So we have a payload as we do with other MQTT technologies. And we have a key here. What is the key? I have told you before that the key groups the data within a topic. So in our example, we could group the data that we send for the current amounts by the product ID. So I would send the product ID to the key here, and I would send the corresponding data. So what really interesting is the current amount. We send it to the payload. So the payload consists of a JSON document that consists of the current amount and the product ID. Yeah, so we have everything. We will trigger if the current amount changes on machine 1, and we send it the current amount together with the product ID once to the JSON document and to the Apache Kafka system, and we use the product ID as a key to group the data by the product ID. What is the advantage to send it to the Apache Kafka instead of sending it directly to the palletizer? One of the biggest advantages is we directly can add consumers like analytics systems, real-time analytics systems, to create real-time analytics on the produced parts on each machine. In our example, the machine 1. And also other consumers could be filled with data in addition to the palletizer system. And we only have one target system here in OPC Router to send the data to. Now we are ready and we can set this connection productive. This means the configuration will be sent to the runtime service in the background. We have the green objects, what we have configured new, and we can say, yes, everything should be right, and we want to set it productive. With this version, we still have to restart and set the whole project productive on the OPC Router service. With the next version planned for March, you will be able to set the plugin productive at the first place, and when you come to the communication data transfers, then you can set the data transfer productive on its own, so you don't have to restart the whole OPC Router service for that. So now it is ready. So we can go to the status tab. The information is given to the OPC Router service. Of course, the OPC Router service still has to initialize itself. What can we see at the status tab? We can see the service status on its own. There you get an overview on the service status, and you will have some graphics on how many connections are already initializing, are ready, are stopped, and whatever. You can have status information or diagnostic information on each plugin, also for the Kafka, for example, or for the shop floor OPC UA server. And of course, you have the status information on each connection. You have them grouped in the folders as we have structured it before. And even on the folder, you can see what happens with the connections below. So if there is an error, then we would have a cross instead of these green signs here. So we now see for the connection that it is green, it is running. We see the green points. This means it is running successfully. And we have the timestamp when the data transfer happens, so when the current amount changes. And we see how long it takes. And below we have our current connection, and we can see the current amount growing up. And we can see the corresponding current production order. And we see the created JSON structure that we write to the Apache Kafka system. So now the data are in the Kafka, they are ready to be streamed or analyzed.